Unlike on Twitter where we have the retweet button, the process of mimetic snowballing by which we form or assemble a mob, in the real world, it's as if our societies are physically structured to make these kind of things less likely to happen. So it seems like a lot of debates in recent times have revolved around this question of whether social media somehow causes or leads to violence. And, here we can think about how, when there are mass shootings or things like that, there's a question of whether the person was radicalized on social media. When you think about something like January 6th, right, there's a question of how instrumental, social media platforms were in kind of leading to that event. I find this on one level a kind of tricky discussion to have, because the problem is that, we have plenty of examples of previous periods in which this technology didn't exist, in which similar types of incidents occur, and in fact may even occur with greater frequency, right? So for example, there was a period of extremely frequent left-wing terrorism across the West starting in the late 60s all the way into the 80s, right? And so, these people were radicalized, they were engaging in all sorts of violence, but they weren't, they were, whatever they were radicalized by, it clearly wasn't social media. And so, we don't really have, as much as people might talk about the kind of violent or illiberal strains of the contemporary left, we don't really have anything quite like that happening nearly to the same degree as we did then. So, it's just a little bit hard to parse, because if we want to claim that a particular communication technology has a causal role in leading to certain violent incidents, we have to imagine that these incidents or these sorts of incidents would not occur without that communication technology. And that's always pretty hard to determine, because, it just becomes the question of, are people carrying out these kind of acts using the technologies that happen to exist today, or are the technologies somehow instrumental in bringing them about? People don't ask this enough, I would argue, in much of the commentary on this subject. And, that's whether it's sort of left-wingers concerned about the radicalization of young men on 4chan or whatever, or whether it's right-wingers who are worried about left-wing mobs or whatever. So I think this is all a little bit complicated. What I would argue is relevant from Girard is his idea that an effective, which isn't to say necessarily a good or admirable, social institution is one that in some way contains violence, and this is contains in both senses of the word. So it contains in the sense of possessing an element of violence or having an element of violence within it, but it also contains in the sense of placing some kind of brake on the spread of violence. And so the classic example of this is that he analyzes at length, of course, is sacrifice, right? Which again is, he regards as a kind of vaccination against violence, right? Which, injects a sort of ritualized dose of violence into the social body in order to prevent its uncontrolled spread. This, is essential to how he understands the efficacy of social institutions as pacifying or stabilizing, right? And the point at which social institutions cease to function, cease to be operative in this way, in their containing function, is the point at which this small dose of violence sort of itself begins to be magnified, and it, somehow is no longer seen as legitimate or acceptable violence, but is instead seen as illegitimate or morally problematic. And therefore, the distinction between kind of accepted or legitimate violence and not accepted and not legitimate violence becomes blurry, right? And so here we might think about the George Floyd protests and riots of 2020, right? Where, as with all of these, recent incidents, what's going on here is a kind of violence that embodies the state's, to use Max Weber's term, monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, right? Which is, essentially the police engaging in an act that, is in a sense illicit because of that state monopoly on violence. But that is no longer seen as acceptable or permissible. And the result is a kind of, breaking down of social order to some extent, right? So similarly, Girard argues, in ancient societies, you had sacrificial crises where a sacrifice came to no longer seem acceptable, and as a result was, in some way seen as problematic or as violating some kind of norm or taboo rather than being, contained within the existing norms or taboos, and therefore seen as problematic and could lead to a kind of crisis. So returning to social media here, it's very clear that social media contains violence in the first sense of the word, which is it, as we saw very early in its development, seemed to incubate a kind of violent, lashing out, a kind of tendency towards, extreme, conflict and rivalry, as well as a tendency towards a kind of, ballooning of mobs, often engaged in a kind of collective victimization of somebody who was seen as having violated some norm or taboo. So it clearly contains this kind of element of violence, and particularly kinds of violence that I think we're unlikely to see in the real world today, right? Such as, something like a lynch mob or an actual, witch hunting or something like that. And so the question is whether this kind of violence, right, is fundamentally destabilizing of the society at large. In other words, whether it threatens to spill out into the real world, or whether it in some way functions as a kind of release valve for these sort of social tendencies that, perhaps has the benefit, despite its great unpleasantness, of not leading directly to any kind of real world consequences for the most part. So, this is often brought up by the people who are sort of skeptics of like the idea of cancel culture. What they'll say is like, oh yeah, well, that person got canceled, they got mobbed on Twitter or whatever, but they didn't, they're still alive. They're not, it may have like harmed them socially in some way, but it didn't actually bring about any real physical harm to them, right? And so it can't really be compared to, a witch hunt or something like that. So, this idea is often brought up, right? And here I think it's worth comparing what's happened in the West to, what we have seen some versions of in other parts of the world, particularly South and Southeast Asia, I believe, where you have had cases of, particularly in areas where you have intense conflict between Muslims and Hindus or Muslims and Buddhists. You have actual cases of, what we would call lynchings, basically, groups of, let's say, Hindus ganging up on a Muslim and actually killing them, right? And that these acts have sometimes been facilitated by sites like Facebook. In other words, they've used these sites to organize and, spread rumors about, some about Muslims or about some particular Muslim or Muslim family or community. And that, the spread of rumors has, again, been facilitated on Facebook. And this has sort of then been used to coordinate and organize a mob to go and exact, some kind of vengeance on these people. And so this has happened, right? There are documented cases of it. We should point out that this stands in contrast to much of what we've seen in the sort of Western world, right, where these kind of patterns haven't really taken hold in the same way. And, I would argue that points to something quite different between, Western societies and these societies in the developing world, which is simply that, the basic form and structure of those societies, as they're kind of laid out in physical space is quite different, right? Which is that people tend to live in, relatively, closely connected, tightly knit communities of people who are related to each other in some way, Anthropologists call this a kinship society, right? A society where basically you know all the people in your village or town to some extent. You kind of know where you stand in relation to them. And, what this means is that when somebody who's in this network that you're part of is slighted in some way, or you believe that they've been slighted or harmed, right, then you're far more likely to actually gang up with the other people you are connected to in this way and exact some kind of retaliation, right, against whoever is seen as the enemy. And, when we live in a Western society, what this means is usually that we don't know our neighbors all that well, that we don't live that close to the people who we're most tightly connected to. And so that, we're essentially atomized. And what this means is that, unlike on Twitter where we have the retweet button, the difficulty of mounting a kind of a kind of process of mimetic snowballing by which we form or assemble a mob in the real world is far less likely, right? It's as if our societies are physically structured to make these kind of things less likely to happen. So, what this means is that these kind of processes occurring on social websites, actually marks a contrast with the way that our lives and sort of social groupings are actually laid out in the real world, and I think helps us explain why the kind of hyper-mimetic dynamics that take hold on social sites, we don't necessarily see that many correlates to them, particularly in political conflicts in the real world, right? And I think to sum up here, what we have not seen, despite some spectacular instances, is a kind of massive outpouring of political violence, right? Instead, what we've seen is this kind of simulation of that on these social sites, but always in the enabled by the sort of mimetic structures that they allow. But these have not tended to find expression in that many cases in the real world, and when they have tended to fizzle out rather than really gain traction and explode, right? And obviously there are some counterexamples, some quite remarkable counterexamples, but I think even those have tended to fizzle out rather than escalate, right? And I would argue this has to do with the way our societies are actually physically structured. And, the contrast I would draw here is we have not seen a huge explosion of political violence despite all the sound and fury. That said, the United States is a relatively violent country for the Western world, but most of the violence that takes place is not political, it is interpersonal. And if we think here of gangs, of let's say rival drug gangs, what obtains in that context is quite different, right? It has to do with, again, these kind of tightly knit human groupings, right? And with some kind of sense of collective honor where it's not simply, squabbling over territory or resources or whatever. It's also that, that squabble embodies some kind of conflict over some kind of fundamental sense of honor and values. And so, we see that type of, deeply interpersonal relationship can, generate and does generate a great deal of violence in the form of sort of tit-for-tat gang violence, for instance. If we want to think about where where murders and things like that are most heavily concentrated, we have to look there. And we do not really see anything equivalent to that coming out of these kind of social media realms of rivalry and conflict. And I think that tells us something about the way these are really functioning, which to go back to my opening question, I would argue is more as a kind of means of acting out or simulating these types of tendencies, but in a way that, perhaps functions as a kind of pressure valve, rather than a sort of trigger for the explosion of these conflicts more broadly.
Hey, what's up? If you enjoyed this video, take a second to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We publish videos like this several times a week. And also, if you're interested in studying the work of René Girard on your own, we made an awesome, totally free 18-page study guide that you can download at girardcourse.com. It's expertly curated. It's in a logical sequence that's going to help you master his entire body of work at your own pace. You can go ahead and get that at girardcourse.com. All right, that's all I got for you. Over and out.